Hello, and welcome to the webinar, Driving True Interoperability with a FHIR-enabled data activation platform, with the emphasis on the payer market, those of you who work at various payers in the country. I'm Dr. David Nace, Chief Medical Officer here at Innovaccer, and I'm very pleased to see all of you join. So with that, let me introduce our panelists. So, myself, as I've introduced, I've been in the payer market for a long time, worked at Aetna, worked at McKesson serving the payer market, even spent some time building Optum as a company when it was called Specialized Care Services many years ago. And I'm pleased to welcome Mike Sutton. Mike is the Chief Technology Officer here at Innovaccer and had come here from Kaiser Permanente, where he was Chief Technology Officer. He's got a deep experience in IT, having served as CIO at very prestigious organizations prior to Kaiser. Mike, welcome.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here.
Great to have you. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Aaron Sin. Aaron is Senior Director of Product Management for our payer market and came to us from McKinsey, where he was directly focused on the payer market. Aaron, welcome.
Nice to be here. Thanks, David.
Awesome. All right. So let's get into it. The agenda for today is we're going to go over a brief timeline review of the healthcare interoperability journey so far. We're going to talk about the CMS interoperability rule and the patient access rules that have been recently released. And boy, lots of things hit the fan at the same time. We're going to talk about the impact of the current pandemic and how that's transforming healthcare and really highlighting issues around interoperability and bringing us to light this holy grail we've talked about for so long is what is the importance of true interoperability and how do we get there? And lastly, what is the role of FHIR, and particularly a FHIR-based approach for addressing priorities for different payer organizations as they try to meet the regulatory requirements in these rules and the changing healthcare environment. So let's start off with doing a brief review of the history that got us here about interoperability. You know, we started creating a national coordinator position back in 2004 in the government, which is now the Office of the National Coordinator, ONC. We tried to talk about setting up a national health information network, and then the HITECH Act was passed right as we plunged into recession. Lots of spending to digitalize healthcare. Blue Button Initiative, trying to get patients to be able to download their information, and we started the journey of meaningful use. The CCD was conceptualized then as an element for standard packaging of clinical information within a EHR. The Argonaut project started, and that's when discussions around FHIR first began. We've been on that journey for a while. Commonwealth was stood up, and I was at McKesson when we stood it up, and it was an idea to get EMRs to exchange information, and we saw the 21st Century Cures Act pass, which we recently saw the rule relating from that, coming from that release. Blue Button wasn't quite enough, and we had better technology. We saw that drive, and people started realizing the importance of payers in interoperability, and the Da Vinci project came right out of the work done at Argonaut. And just last year, CMS published its proposed rule for us to review, 9115B. We're going to talk a lot about that. And then in 2020, CMS finalized the rule right as we were going into this pandemic, along with the patient access being rule, the 21st Century Cures Act rule being published as well. So here we are today. 9115F is published. Gosh, we probably have a lot of work to do, particularly in the payer market. So Aaron, walk us through what some of the needs coming out of this will be from a compliance standpoint.
Yeah, thanks for that, David. I think as you have all started to see with this particular 9115 finalized rule, there's really four components, and we're putting down the highlights for this particular discussion. The first phase is really oriented around the January 1st timeline, also recognizing that CMS has pushed back start of enforcement by 6 months. And it's really centered around the patient access and provider directory APIs. efforts that are really oriented around making interoperability better, and specifically better for the member, so that the member can get access to certain claims and clinical information through third-party applications where they give permission to, and secondarily, where they can get some foundational details on the provider directory, and also in the case of MAPD plans, the pharmacy directory details. I really contrast that with the next phases coming in 2022, both January and April, oriented around data exchanges. One is on the payer-to-payer side, helping facilitate member transitions from different health plans so that the United States core data for interoperability, the clinical data in that particular set, can be moved from plan to plan. The federal state data exchanges focus on a slightly different element, oriented around improving the experience for Medicare and Medicaid dual eligible members and enabling additional data sharing in that particular space for better care coordination.
Great overview. Lots of different things for us to be thinking about. And what's really interesting is March 6th was just as this pandemic was starting. So what we now see is not only changes in the way we're looking at delivering healthcare, maybe not just now, but maybe going forward, and how interoperability is even more of a highlighted issue than ever before. Aaron, walk us through how the pandemic is currently driving the need for interoperability.
I think everyone is seeing the need here from the early stages of doing reporting on lab results and then doing case investigations and contact tracing, and recognizing through this pandemic that those needs and there are specific gaps with how we manage it currently in the United States. I think some great examples are around how we transition lab results from where it's reported to the primary care physicians or to the hospital, how we share information up through the public health agencies and eventually rolling that into the CDC. There have been clear gaps into how that's been done, what standards are used to try to track those results. Interoperability is a clear need in that particular area. Social distancing, likewise, has also driven providers and patients alike to adopt telehealth technologies. CMS has supported this by accelerating some of the reimbursement rules, especially in the Medicare space, and also the applicability of telehealth visits when it comes to risk adjustment and other needs. And similarly, states are also supporting private providers and payers in driving adoption of telehealth, recognizing that it's not just a need now, it's going to be a need over the next months into next year, and it's likely something to stay even after the pandemic is directly addressed.
Wow, that's really interesting. And we've all been talking about how telehealth may play a greater role going forward. So what's your view, Aaron, of where this might be heading in terms of the role of telehealth?
It's really an interesting thought, and I would actually broaden it beyond just telehealth and talk a bit more about virtual care. The recognition that there is an opportunity to provide care in a remote setting, audiovisual and other modalities, that it's actually feasible and can be done in a sustainable manner that really addresses care coordination and clinical needs. I think the pandemic was kind of a forcing function to move faster that way, where there was a lot of, I'll call it, kind of inertia of going with the status quo of coming in for every single visit. We're not saying that everything's going to go virtual. By no means is the industry going to move that way, or nor would it make sense clinically, but there are certain areas where such a transition is going to be important. And then I think the kind of more open question is, how across the entire value chain, patient, providers, payers, etc., how will the collaborations happen along with this shift?
No, that's great. And having in the past 3 months, having had 1 or 2 telehealth visits myself, I can tell you they were much more convenient. Mike, you were at Kaiser for 5 years, and Kaiser's made tremendous strides in telehealth as well as moving into virtual care. Tell us a little bit about your view of where this is heading.
Yeah, so thanks, Dr. Ney. So when we installed, kind of our telehealth visits, Kaiser was an early adopter of all that, many years ago, but the uptake was moderate at best. And, I think the numbers are, in the thousands of calls per day was kind of what we did. I remember a lot of people accused me of overbuilding the system, as the enterprise architect, of overbuilding the solution, and applying, the gold plating that so many engineers get accused of. But, once my understanding now is after March, that number increased almost 40-fold. And, fortunately, we had a very good solution for that. And I think it's like what both Dr. Sin and you have said, David, is that I think people, physicians and clinicians, were perhaps a bit surprised about how effective the visits were, and how willing members and patients are to take and use a video visit instead of going into the office themselves now that they can. The interesting part will be, what's the guess? What's the number that we think it's going to be, when things return to, whatever normal turns out to be in this situation. And we've been doing a number of visits across virtual visits across the country, we at Innovator, to see what people's opinions on that. We're getting ranges of opinions that will go back to maybe 20% of the current volumes, to other people are so bullish to say it could be up to 80%. So it's just going to be very interesting times, to see what the adoption stays, on a steady state basis.
Great comments. And, I'd be really interested in kind of how our panelists, how our attendees, the folks joining our webinar, which we've got a little bit over 100, are currently looking at this issue. So, clearly to move into telehealth and virtual care, we're going to need better data exchange, better interoperability. We have these regular requirements. So let's turn it over to taking a poll. This is our first poll. So the question that we're going to pose, we're going to open the poll to everybody joining the webinar. Please use your text box in your control panel to vote. First question, of the regulatory requirements included in CMS 9115F, what's the interoperability role? What's your organization's priority? Is it having a patient access API, having a provider directory API, really having the capability to involve yourself in payer-to-payer exchange, or for the dual eligibles, the ability to do federal state data exchanges? So while we take that poll, I'd be really interested, Mike, you've come from Kaiser, which is a very interesting and unique organization, to a broader landscape. Where do you think the challenges probably lie across the country for payers?
So as you mentioned in my background, I've been in healthcare for 7 years now, and prior to that, I was in a number of other industries, and including the energy industry, the hospitality business. I worked for a cruise line, and then even in the government, where information exchange is paramount, to share information, especially in the counterterrorism realm. And it's surprising to me when I came to healthcare, the amount of slowness in adopting these technologies that have been around in the industry for really decades. And not that these other industries had a regulation to meet, they really were doing it because these mechanisms of sharing data are so much more efficient. They're less expensive to operate your IT environment, reduces a lot of redundancy in data and duplication. And quite frankly, and a lot because of the reduction in redundancy, it's a more secure environment. So all those industries I mentioned went to these types of technologies, application programming interfaces, really decades ago. I remember in the cruise line business in the early 2000s, the entire industry adopted, at that time it was just 4 APIs as part of the Open Travel Alliance. And I don't think it took but a year, and I don't think I've never not booked my own travel since those days. And I think, to answer your question directly, I think there's a lot of similar, I think maybe a parallel to the telehealth business. There was slow adoption until we had to. I think the same thing happens with the APIs, because people aren't certain, not sure what the benefit is. But I think once we have to in this industry, we're going to find out, how did we ever exist without these before? And so I just think there's a lot of resistance from how can I share my data and make sure it's safe and protected and secure? And that's a lot of, I think where the next few years are going to be in meeting these dates, is ensuring, just because we can share data doesn't mean it becomes more apt to be stolen or compromised.
Well, I can't wait to book all my appointments online and for my medical care. So I'm thrilled about that. So let's take a look. Wow, patient access. There we go. Just as I said, right? We're becoming more patient focused. Aaron, what do you think of these results?
I think I expect results of kind of this slant. I think part of it is really a focus on the near-term requirements around the patient access and provider directory APIs. I also see the industry really focused on the patient and the member side. That's an area where there's kind of broader agreement that we need to do a better job of sharing member level details and also clinical level details to members, making it easy to access. And then it's an extension really of that when you talk about the data exchanges, about making it payer-to-payer and federal state sharing. It's still the same fundamental information, especially the clinical data, but to different entities.
Awesome. So let's get into it. The final interoperability rules really speak to some very key outcomes. So, every American should be able to see, obtain, and use their electronically available medical information that's relevant to them and make better decisions. That's what this is all about, making better decisions. And Mike, you brought up a couple key points that much of these technologies have been around for a long time. So obviously we want to increase access and accountability, but I want to focus on these two bolded issues, because not everybody fully understands, like, what is an API? What is an application programming interface? And what is it going to bring to the market in terms of interoperability and secure access? And also, there's a lot of misunderstanding about what is FHIR. We're at FHIR version 4. What does that mean? Does it allow us to exchange all information? We're going to really get into this stuff. But, the ultimate goal is allowing patients to shop for, understanding their options, getting care, empowering patients to control their information. And lastly, and I want to really emphasize this, supporting an application economy like we currently all have on our cell phones, where we can download applications and use them and grant information as we do, and bring that to healthcare so we can all work together. So I really want to focus on these two issues of API and FHIR. So let's kind of get into it. Let's start off with where we are today. So I know you got pretty deep into this when you were at Kaiser, but Mike, walk us through kind of what the current state of data exchange is in the payer market.
So I think I think everybody will agree, there's the amount of APIs being used in the payer market is extremely low. I think there's a lot of aspirations to get to that place, but I would say that the majority of exchanges still going on in the payer market are, and I'll apologize if this gets a little too technical. I know Dr. Sin and Dr. Nace always keep me honest on this, but the majority of interchange today are in batch files. They're files that are taken out of the transaction systems, whether it's claims information or it's the EMR information or a lab system or whatever, and it's put in a file just like you have on your computer at home, a file with a name on it. And it probably, although in not all cases, it follows a particular format of the data inside that file, and it's certainly one of the HL7 files. And that data then there's a whole system within your IT environment that extracts that data out of the EMR systems or the claim systems. There's a process called file transfer protocols, and they call them FTP servers, where the data is put on this FTP server, which is it's one of the favorite places that hackers start to look when they want to steal information. So, but people can protect that. They know how to protect it. But then that information then goes to another program where this data is sent to the person they're exchanging data with. And in no cases is it a patient themselves. It's generally to the payer, another provider, and the data there's a program there. This goes into an FTP server at the receiving site, and then there's a whole nother program that knows that format that has to be run to calculate and create that data to put it in the other system on the receiving side. So as you can imagine, it's an exponential problem because these files get sent to numerous different payers, numerous providers are involved. And so if you looked at it from an architecture slide, it's a bunch of arrows going back and forth, which is really inefficient. And that's really kind of the state of almost everybody today is kind of grow all these connections going back and forth, sending thousands, if not petabytes of information through these techniques.
No, that makes a lot of sense, Mike. And, I think it really highlights a number of the key challenges that payers face, which are, there are all these different electronic transaction standards. There's a lack of a singular standardized data format. You have all these different systems, and those of us who work in payers and have worked in payers, there's like a gazillion systems that don't speak to each other, and trying to get the data aggregated and then to be able to leverage that, which is a huge feat, which we can get into. And then ultimately in the clinical landscape, it leads to a lack of coordination for care. And one of the biggest challenges that we have is, we don't have a single patient identifier across the landscape, either within organizations with multiple data feeds as well as across the country. So Aaron, we have these interoperability rules and there's a need to be compliant. So in order to be compliant, what do we need to do about these challenges?
I think from compliance standpoint, interpreted narrowly, it's really about supporting those particular 4 elements that we highlighted within the CMS 9115 final rule. And really the purpose of the regulations, if you take a step back, is to standardize the ways that information can be exchanged and the ways the APIs are set up to make it easier for the member, for the patient, and to also make it easier for other payers and to facilitate the federal and state exchanges later on in April 2022. But if you take a step back, there's also a much greater opportunity and need when it comes to broader interoperability that David referenced earlier. And it's really just compliance is just one component of that. The way kind of we've seen the industry move towards is that there's a recognition that, first, the clinical data is really important for payers. And whether this is for chart review on the CM or the UM side, the care management or the utilization management side, or whether it's for certain coding or quality gaps, there's a great need to get that clinical data. The best way to get at it, and Mike kind of alluded to this, is directly from the EMR. Get it from the source system and connect to it and ensure that you have high quality data. Interoperability also has a lot of sway in driving cross-system connectivity and custom workflows. I want to highlight that more as a conceptual point, as a way to kind of think about how can you go after use cases or needs that you have from your standpoint within your payer organization that goes beyond existing systems or existing workflows that have been the status quo. Can you piece together different elements? Let's say, for instance, using gaps as an example, what if you could flag a quality gap for the provider and then make sure you got the chart to document that. And then at the same time, you pass that information to the member and you gave them a heads up before they saw their PCP. That's kind of an example of that cross-system connectivity and custom workflows that can enable that type of effort. And it really depends on interoperability foundations. And the unified patient record is really that kind of long-term vision for this. We know right now that this information is in many different places. As a member switches between plans, as a patient moves between different providers, inpatient, outpatient, or maybe they got a one-off visit at an urgent care, or they got a one-off visit within a telehealth network. All those are really different pieces of information, different data points on one's health and one's health care that are in silos in the current state.
No, these are great points, Aaron. I really like this comment about on this slide about custom workflows. You know, if you've been to one provider's office, if you've been to one health system, everybody does things differently, and we need to be able to adapt to that in addition to having the kind of interoperability you've described. But the holy grail is being able to see all the information about a patient in one place, unified patient records. And that really is kind of where we're heading. And certainly in FHIR, it's one of the things that we've really focused on providing to our clients. So with that said, because this is so important for this audience, Mike, what will payers need to do to really get to compliance with these regulations?
Okay, well, I'll start with the good news. The good news is because these technologies have been around for a while, there's a fulsome selection of infrastructure in the IT department that can set up these API, enabling these APIs. And so that's really kind of the first thing is, you're going to have to do an audit of, different EMRs have different levels of maturity with their APIs. Some organizations, have APIs, but to me is you kind of pick out, you have that inventory, what systems you have, what's available to be enabled, and make sure you have the right infrastructure. And then it's not on that chart, but the second thing, and almost probably one of the most important parts, is making sure that you have governance, a data governance for your enterprise and for your exchange partners, so that, because it's really important to know what data is being shared, because like Dr. Sin mentioned, these are not the same in every system. One provider, one payer may have very, very different meanings to some of the data that's used, and specifically when we start talking about custom workflows, that data doesn't exist in all the systems, and that's where FHIR becomes very important because it standardizes the way that data is to be exchanged. And then the good news is then there are a lot of providers out there that have set up data exchanges, whether they do it through a gateway type product, or they create a unified patient record and do some sort of persistence. These environments are out there and available and evolving in the healthcare space, but the generic ability to pass APIs is well known, well understood. And then the kind of the last 2 points on here is there will have to be, and our feeling at FHIR anyway, is when you start making this data available to your members and patients, is that there should be some development. You don't have to. You can use standard products that come out from the company, the product companies. But our feeling is that that mobile app or that website with the patient is very intimate between the payer and the member of that health plan. And so you would have to do it, and I think in our opinion, developing your own interaction with your members, because that's your brand, is something that you probably should make some investment in as well.
Now that gives a clear view, I think, of some of the things that really need to be tackled. Let's go back to our audience and take another poll and say, for each of you, now that we've sort of outlined some of these things that need to be done to be compliant and to meet these goals, what are the key challenges currently with interoperability transformation in your organization? So a couple choices here. Is it managing unstructured healthcare data like text-based notes or radiology reports? Is it development of new infrastructure within the organization, rip and replace your data warehouse, or develop new technologies to replace old ones? Is it security issues? Are those the top around data exchange? Because there's a lot of concern about that and the ramifications if you have insecure systems. Is it this issue of workflows, altering your existing workflows? Or lastly, is it the whole cost involved with just transformation? So as we take that poll is live now. I actually want to ask Aaron. Aaron, you've been kind of surveying the payer landscape, both at McKinsey and your 4 or 5 years there, and then certainly here, having this role of focusing on the payer market. What's your view of what payers are currently challenged with across the country?
Yeah, I think I would really focus on 2 particular buckets, right? I think one is really around access to high quality data, especially when it comes to clinical data. Claims data, I think every payer really sees as foundational. Getting some additional details on the pharmacy or lab side has proven easier than getting details on the clinical data side. Part of it is an access question, how do I get it? And then part of it is, if I have it, am I really realizing the full value that I can get from that information? Especially when it comes to moving beyond the easier elements. Let's say, when did a member get care? When did they get admitted? Or what the diagnoses are? And delving deeper into the actual encounters and the progress notes. Is there value to be realized there, whether it's from a sense of measuring risk and stratifying the risk at the population level, or driving more individualized care decisions? I think there's some potential there, and payers are seeing that. The other goes to that workflows piece. Taking a step back, what if you had a way to redefine kind of how you went after some of your core clinical and business needs? Is there a way to do so beyond the standard constructs that have existed for some time, and drive incremental value there? I expect in some ways COVID to kind of help rethink that move towards more virtual care, towards telehealth, is opening up new opportunities, and setting a bar as to what is possible. But that's where I see the industry going towards.
Well, let's take a look at our audience and see what they think. We can pull up poll results. Interesting. Unstructured healthcare data right at the top, and then obviously replacing all these old technologies we have. Mike, you've been around the block a long time. What do you think here?
Well, I definitely agree, because there are so many, and the word unstructured there, I'm certain that there are structured data environments in there as well, but they're not well documented. There's no common glossary, and like I mentioned before, a data element in one system with a particular name may mean something totally different in another system. And so when you combine this data, and it's like Aaron was saying, the data that we get or you get from a Minute Clinic, or the data you get from some claims, it is very, very hard to tie these things together when there's not a common glossary of these terms. And so these end up being unstructured. So I do agree with the audience that a big part of that is, how do you create the unified view from all these different sources, and that certainly is one of the most complex issues before you can get to the point to create a nice crisp API that represents the data that has been aggregated.
No, wow, that's a great comment. It's fascinating, and I really want to get into the issue of how can we solve these challenges. So first, as I mentioned before, the Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resource, which we all refer to as FHIR, is often misunderstood by so many people. I still remember going to a conference like 4.5 years ago and having some CIO of a very large health system say, FHIR is going to solve everything within a year. And I think everybody's looking at each other, what, somebody's on fire? So Mike, talk a little bit about this whole and help to crystallize for the audience what FHIR is, what it isn't, and particularly how it relates to APIs.
Okay, so FHIR is a bit of a mythical, magical, possible solution to a lot of the interoperability issues in the healthcare space. So FHIR, when you have an application programming interface, there's a number of parts to that API, and one of the most important parts is the data that is transferred, between one place and the next. And the good news and what FHIR has done, it is very specific in defining what that field is. Simple cases is what is a first name, what is a last name, what is a middle initial, what is a gender, and then it gives possible glossaries of what those values can be. Because the nice thing with the APIs, as opposed to what's been done in the batch world, is that the content of that data never gets adjudicated or rectified until it hits the recipient system, and they have a number of rules they apply against it that are different. When you start talking about APIs and FHIR in particular, it is defining what those rules are. So in anybody that's transferring information using this API, which is going to have the same definition. And then going back to, APIs is kind of a big scary word, but really from a technology perspective, we have been using, programming interfaces, really for 30 years. This is just much more advancement and standardization about how data is understood and transferred. I will stop there, but I am also in the camp of what Dr. Nace was talking about. Is I do believe that what these APIs can do, and in particular FHIR specified APIs, is provide transparency and commonality as we interact in a very complex and fragmented healthcare system.
No, absolutely. And, it's funny. I still remember when I was talking to one of the leads at Gartner, it's been around a long time, and says, we've been using APIs since the 1960s. Everybody thinks it's something brand new, hot off the press. And then I agree, FHIR is a mystical, it's going to solve everything. And we're only just starting really to implement FHIR, and only in a piecemeal way, I think. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I would just emphasize, the learnings I had when it happened with the Open Travel Alliance is we started very small. And, I think the version 4 that's out now has been through a number of iterations with a lot of people participating in the development of it. And, my recommendation to, large enterprises starting this is you don't have to there's 146 resources that have been defined in the current FHIR spec. Is you don't have to start out with all of them. It is, pick 5, pick 6. When I was in the government, we did 16 because you kind of, it's the classic, crawl, walk, run. And the good news is once you get a couple of them going and you get the system working, you get the infrastructure in place, you get the quality checks in place, adding one more each time, it just gets easier and easier. So I highly recommend, and we did this at Kaiser Permanente as well. We picked some of the more, common attributes, demographic data, certain condition codes, all the things that people extend. Start with the basics and work that through the whole system, get it working end to end, and then you'll find adding them on is incrementally easier and easier as it goes.
Well, that makes it sound a lot easier to gulp in one swoop and thinking about going forward. So let's pull this all together, Mike. If we're going to think about the architecture that's needed really to address these standards, these regulatory requirements in the healthcare payer market, walk us through the various components and just give us an overview of how one should think about this.
This is a very dangerous slide, David, because I could probably go on this one for a number of hours, but I will not because we only have 20 minutes. But I think from you go top down, data access, I think, and we've mentioned it, we have a number of legacy environments out there today. They're not sending things out in FHIR FHIR compliant APIs right now today. So certainly you need the environment, and that's what that first little block is to take those. But we have to, this is going to be a journey, just like, the implementation of the EMRs took a very long time, probably over a decade to get that in. I think that, a good platform has to be able to support the older environments, the CCDAs, the flat files, and the direct SQL access. So you've got to have the ability to handle heterogeneous sources, because not everyone's going to be there overnight. There's large investments in these in the payer markets. And then the second one is kind of data management. I think it's really important that and you see the big word governance there. It's not the probably the most interesting topic in there, but it's incredibly critical because the governance, many people relate that to information is power. Is we do need to decide what we can share and what can't be shared, and what the organization and enterprise and how they want to protect it, because we're not going to get away from the HIPAA regulations on compromising patients' data. It is as important now as it has forever, and so you need to have a good governance structure in place for that. Aaron talked a little bit about the data model. I'll go to the master patient index. This is a nuance that a lot of people will see once they start the implementation. Is once you start bringing in data from different sources, there are different MRNs, MRN numbers, different reference numbers. Names are not always the same. I think it's very critical that you have a capability that can merge those records. So you're putting the same information together under the right person. And that gets quite complex. Many enterprises haven't solved that, internally. Now we're going to do it in a kind of a composite world of many different payers and many different providers. I think we've talked about quality, numeracy. You have to have the ability to make sure you have good quality around the data. You know where the data came from and where it's going. It's called lineage. And so that's a key element of any program here. I mentioned security. Part of the regulation is OAuth 2 is the agreed upon authentication standard that we're going to be using. It's well understood, I think, in the technology world. It also provides a lot of protection for the data. I won't go through each of these, but security, of course, is paramount. And then the last one is kind of the data integration. There's the receiving side, which is complex. There's also the sending side. We need to support multiple protocols. Like I said before, not everybody's going to get to the same place at the same time. So we've got to be able to manage that heterogeneity on that integration side. And then in the bottom right, and any IT guys on here will know, you must have the ability to monitor and support your system, because this is quite complex, and it has to have high reliability, high quality, and all that. So hopefully I hit the highlights there, David.
No, that was great, and I agree. You and I have had many kind of deep dive discussions. You could speak about each one of these boxes for a long time. And each is very important. We need access to data, right? That's what the rules require. We need to manage our data, and really having a unified data model is what people often struggle with. I know you've talked about being in organizations and seeing organizations that have multiple patient master indexes, even for one organization. We have to solve that problem. And managing the quality of data, garbage in, garbage out, is huge. Security is hugely important to payers and providers. And then lastly, how do we integrate? And that bottom right is, how do we make this useful, right, for the people delivering care and for patients? So, Aaron, I want to ask you, you've been, working to really develop a solution for how do you make a platform for payers leveraging FHIR APIs. Walk us through how you're thinking about this.
Yeah, I'll build on what Mike has covered so far. I think foundationally, what a lot of the, I'll call it the press and the regulations have focused on is really more on that kind of right-hand side around what are some of the standards-based APIs that are needed to expose information to the right kind of applications on behalf of the members in particular, using the patient access API in particular. But from a kind of broader healthcare data platform standpoint, there are a much broader set of needs. And going left to right, I'll highlight, the left-hand side, it's really around access to the right sources of data. Mike has covered a bit on the data exchange side, the data formats that need to be supported. Backward compatibility and kind of multi-protocol, multi-format compatibility is important now. Part of interoperability is to try to standardize this, but in the current world, you're going to need to support multiple different levels. And ensuring two items there. It's not just getting the information one time. It's about getting a kind of good historical amount of data, let's say, for your set of members. And being able to get an ongoing feed of that information, especially as those members get more care, especially as your membership base expands. This really applies to the clinical data and the claims data that's particularly important. But recognize that there's a whole slew of other data sources that could be important here, whether it's SDOH data, whether it's information on the lab side or the pharmacy side. Even supporting data elements like the provider directory or your member attribution. This is all information that is helpful when you're taking a more holistic look at a healthcare data platform. These are the inputs that you need. Once you have that information, then you start opening up the opportunity to pointing that at different analytics you may want to run, at different front-end applications that could be a focus here. And Mike, maybe you kind of focus a bit more than on the centralized part of the healthcare data platform as to the three categories that we've seen in the industry as particularly important.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. And I think that, this is kind of where the debate is going to be in the next couple of years, because there are some people that believe that once the source systems that we have on the left side here are producing those APIs, they can just be sent directly to the right-hand side, to the consumers of that information. But I think an alternative, and what many other people are saying, is there's unification that's required for that data. Because if we just do straight pass-throughs straight out of the transactional healthcare systems, what it's going to do is like we talked about, unifying around a patient record. Well, now we're going to have hundreds of people building unification environments on the receiving side. And then they're likely going to send data back to the left side, to the transactional side, that will require that unification as well. Certainly the opinion of the innovator is that a platform and logic is required in between these to do that level of aggregation, quality, and unification, so that it can be distributed with a high amount of integrity through these FHIR gateways that are on the right-hand side. And just one last point on that too, it's not only sending the data, being syntactically correct, but semantically correct, that have done the right clinical tests to make sure that that reading or that condition code or whatever the case may be in that large list of data elements that is semantically correct for clinical use and payer use on that right-hand side.
Yeah, a lot of folks think interoperability is a simple thing, and there's various types of interoperability, and I think you've hit the hardest one, which is one is sort of a mechanical one. Can the computers talk to each other? Can they share information? Second is, this issue of syntactic interoperability, having standards. And then lastly, semantic, which is the meaning behind data, because there's different types of meanings even if you have standard formats, etc. So what I really like in this slide is this issue of bringing clinical and financial data, and then more importantly, particularly today, around moving into value-based care, quality reporting, and public health. We see this highlighted so much in this epidemic and episodes of care. And then lastly, just being able to think about how members can start to get an application marketplace the way we all have on our cell phones, being able to download applications, give it access to our information at our choice, and having developers have a portal to start innovating. And this is clear. I mean, Mike, you know, we came up with the name for our company, Innovacers, Innovation Acceleration, Innovation Accelerator. And it's really how do we do innovation and move healthcare far beyond where it's been, because it's been kind of stuck technologically. So with that, let's just kind of move over.
Can I just add one point, David, is that not only do the people innovate in the middle, is once this data is made available to other third-party developers, can you imagine, you know, what those 12-year-old kids that were doing Angry Birds before now do some health-based application based on data that they can get about themselves and then make that available to other members and patients around the world? I mean, it's creating an environment for much more innovation than we've been able to have, you know, in the past decades.
Great. So we've got a number of questions from the audience. I'm going to ask one in 1 second, but first let's check in one last time to say we've talked a lot about the movement to solving these problems, APIs and FHIRs. There's this huge evolution in our industry about the leveraging of platforms. So the question is, are people, our audience, are they currently looking for a FHIR-based platform to really solve some of these problems? But I'm going to bring in a question from the audience, Mike. Speaks to exactly what we were just talking about. At what scale of an organization is it worthwhile to bring all these complex interfaces together versus doing things manually, phone, fax to get and send the information? What do you think about that question?
Well, I think probably many of the people on this webinar. I'm sorry, I was getting some feedback. Uh-oh.
Many of the people on this webinar are probably used to doing things with fax and paper. I think it's probably what you're going to.
Well, even during COVID, remember we had to go out and every day had to send 17 data elements, you know, to the government to say how many beds are available, how many new patients came in, and all that. A lot of organizations were doing that with, you know, a manual tally around their hospital or their clinic. Many of them had to do this through Excel spreadsheets. I mean, I just think that, you know, like Dr. Sin talked about early on, the COVID environment, that pandemic caused, to me, showed so many kinks in our ability to share even the simplest of information. You know, and the president's task force was asking for these reports, and you know, we had many customers asking us, how can we get this data? You know, and there's many others that had no solution, and they literally went around filling out Excel spreadsheets. I don't think that's the way a modern healthcare industry should work.
I agree wholeheartedly. So let's go ahead and bring up our poll results and see people are kind of grasping this. So 2/3 of our audience of nearly 100 folks are leaders from the healthcare industry are looking for a platform to address this issue. You know, many people are building it themselves, I would imagine, but Aaron, what do you think of this result? No, we seem to have lost Aaron's voice. Mike, what do you think?
Well, so I think it's incredibly encouraging. I think, I think CMS, has been very savvy in how they've adopted these regulations. But then I go back to one of my earlier points is the regulation is, certainly we need to meet those dates and that's things for pushing it. But to me, enterprises, this is just something along the natural life cycle of an architecture of a modern organization. And so I'm happy to see people are looking at it because they have to. I hope another majority of that group is doing it because they want to go for the efficiencies that these environments build out, the information and the patient centricity of getting their data to them. So I'm encouraged by that 2/3. I'm happy to see that. And again, it's kind of interesting because we're very early on. Of course, there's some dates that have been put out there, but it's good to see this early on in this kind of next wave of evolving architecture in healthcare that there's so many people interested in it.
No, I would echo that result, and it's great to see the interest. I want to get into our last slide. This is the point of view that we've had here at Innovacer is how do you help the industry care as one? And this is so pertinent to what we currently see on the news every day. And how do we get people to really share information in real time? So there are so many sources of data, hospitals, physician labs, there's clinical data, there's all the paid claim data that health plans have and PBMs have on the pharmacy side. There's such an interest, obviously now, in reporting to public health agencies, but in leveraging the social determinants of care, and we've done this in past webinars, around how important it is to connect the community, because that's what really drives outcomes for care. It's the social determinants. And obviously there are still HIEs still out there. We want to be able to leverage them as well. ADTPs, there's many more than that's on here. How do you then bring that data together, unify it from a patient-centered point of view, and then activate that data as insights to all the members that are caring for patients, right? So from a payer perspective is how do you get into the workflow of a doctor and give them insights from the claims data you don't have? How do you get the care managers and the doctors to be working on exactly the same information? How do you manage utilization effectively in real time? How do you engage the member? How do you engage them in using their information effectively? And then lastly, how do you track and manage how the system is going? So we've got one or two questions we're going to get to, but Aaron, why don't you say a little bit from the payer perspective of this care as one infrastructure or viewpoint that we have as a framework here at Innovacer?
Yeah, at Innovacer, we really think about this pretty holistically, and we kind of had two insights that we learned over time and working in this particular environment. One is really around the importance of having a rigorous data and analytics foundation. This is really the core of what you need when it comes to identifying insights that you can act on and making sure that for any particular end user, any particular workflow, any particular system that you have interfacing, whether it's the provider or the member or the care manager, etc., you need high quality information so that they can work with that and take action on it, and you have more confidence as a plan that you're leveraging the best of information that you have. That's really that left-hand side going into the middle of the data activation platform and that unified patient record concept. The right-hand side really aims at different workflows, whether it's provider-facing or member-facing or foundational cost of care, care management, and utilization management. We recognize that the needs are going to be really different and really custom to any particular payer, any particular health plan or line of business. Over time, we started building out this whole kind of ecosystem, not just because there are discrete needs in each of these different buckets, but there's also value, going back to an earlier point, of those custom workflows and cross-system connectivity. Can you target a particular need and manage multiple kind of stakeholder touch points, access points, to drive impact, and to think creatively and broaden the possibilities when it comes to driving those interfaces and even building out completely new flows that address a particular need. It's going to also help as the industry evolves, as things like virtual care ramp up.
Awesome. Well, listen, we had one last question I want to bring in from the audience, and this will be for Mike, but I really love to see the role of APIs here because that's going to be so important. Mike, one last question. What are the thoughts of using FHIR as a method for actually storing the storing of the resources, whether it be data from administrative transactions or clinical data?
So, so by definition, an API is not a data schema. It does define the data that needs to be collected. So, in my opinion, and this is if you talk about kind of raging architectural debates amongst the nerdo crowds, is there going to be one big data model that's the mother of all data models that is going to be FHIR compliant, or that will be the FHIR spec, or will there be multiple data models that serve FHIR APIs? And I think time will tell what that looks like. But I don't think, and this would be my opinion, that the data storage and persistence has to be in the FHIR format. There's a number of people that are out there today that already provide solutions, and they're not doing that because there's a whole set of other information to operate an enterprise, around your own employees and supply chain matters and those things, not currently covered by FHIR. Perhaps they will one day, but I do believe that I don't think we should get too hung up on the actual data storage, because in the history of data, we've had to normalize that data for performance, for different types of analytic capabilities and different joins. So I do not believe there's going to be one data store that is going to solve the FHIR problem, and that's it. I think there will be multiple, and they will all have the ability to produce FHIR APIs. I hope that was clear. That was a fairly technical question, but I hope that was a clear answer.
No, I thought you did a good job, and I really want to thank you, Mike, for the deep, enriched, technical experience in helping us think through the role of FHIR APIs and platforms. And Dr. Sin, thank you very much for attending, giving your insights as a clinician who's worked in the industry, the payer side, thinking about it closely. Thank you, everybody who attended today. We had nearly 100 people from the payer market, all across the country, all leaders in healthcare. Thank you very much. Again, feel free to reach us. Innovacer will follow up with a brief summary of this presentation for you if you want to go back and review it, and some information about kind of what we're doing here to help the industry. Thanks, everybody, and that concludes our webinar. Everybody have a great day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thanks.